Chapter 1, The Incident. The fluorescent lights in the convenience store flickered above Samantha, Sam, Whitfield as she paced nervously down the narrow aisles. It was late, close to midnight, and she had stopped in to grab a few essentials after a long, exhausting day at work. Her phone buzzed in her hand with messages she was too tired to answer. The store was mostly empty, save for an older man behind the counter and a young couple whispering to each other as they picked out snacks. Sam tucked her wavy, dark hair behind her ear, trying to stay focused, but something didn't feel right. She heard footsteps behind her. Slow, heavy, deliberate. It was an instinct, that feeling of being watched, that caused her heart to quicken. She glanced over her shoulder, noticing a large figure in the shadows of the next aisle, wearing dark clothes. Something about the person seemed off. She hurriedly grabbed a loaf of bread and a carton of milk and made her way toward the register. The strange feeling persisted. Her skin prickled as if someone was hovering too close. The man behind the counter greeted her with a tired nod as she fumbled through her wallet. She swiped her card, but just as she was about to leave, she was stopped by a low voice. "Excuse me, ma'am." Sam froze. The voice was deep, commanding, the kind that demanded attention. She turned to see a tall, muscular police officer standing a few feet behind her. His badge glinted under the harsh lights, and his expression was unreadable. "Yes," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you mind stepping outside for a moment?" the officer asked, motioning toward the door. Sam's stomach churned. "Why? Is something wrong?" The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, a second officer appeared by his side, equally large and imposing. Sam suddenly realized how small she felt in comparison. "We just need to ask you a few questions," the first officer said. "Come with us." Her pulse quickened. She glanced at the cashier, but he averted his eyes, already absorbed in the next customer. She felt trapped, surrounded by authority she didn't understand. Outside, the night air was cool and crisp, but the tension was palpable. The parking lot was eerily empty, save for a few cars and a flickering streetlight. The two officers flanked her on either side, their hands resting on their belts, too close to their guns for comfort. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The second officer spoke this time. "We received a report about a suspicious individual matching your description." Sam's heart stopped. "Suspicious? What are you talking about?" "I was just buying groceries." The first officer took a step closer, his expression hardening. "Are you sure about that? We've had reports of loitering in the area. Drug activity. You sure you weren't involved in anything suspicious?" Sam blinked, her mind racing. Was this some kind of joke? She was an accountant, not a criminal. She had no record, no reason to be involved in anything illegal. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just trying to get home," she stammered. The officers exchanged a glance before one of them spoke into his radio. "We're gonna need backup." "Backup? For what?" Chapter 2, The unraveling panic set in as Sam stood there, feeling the weight of the situation crushing down on her. Her hands started trembling, and her thoughts became a whirlwind of confusion and fear. How had she gone from grabbing milk at a convenience store to being surrounded by police officers in an empty parking lot? Was this really happening? The backup arrived sooner than she expected. 2 more patrol cars pulled into the parking lot, lights flashing but sirens off, as if they wanted to handle the situation quietly. More officers emerged, forming a semicircle around her. It was clear they weren't leaving until they had what they wanted. Sam tried to breathe. "This is a mistake," she muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. But it was no mistake, not to them. The first officer, whose name tag read Carter, leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "Are you resisting us right now, ma'am?" Sam's heart hammered in her chest. "Resisting? I'm not resisting. I haven't done anything wrong." Officer Carter didn't seem to hear her, or maybe he didn't care. He was already reaching for her arm. "I need you to calm down." "I am calm." Sam cried, pulling her arm back instinctively. But that was the wrong move. Within seconds, Carter had her pressed against the side of the patrol car, her hands yanked behind her back as she struggled to comprehend what was happening. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into her wrists, and her breath came in ragged gasps. "Stop resisting," another officer shouted. "I'm not." Sam's words were drowned out by the chaos around her. She tried to twist her head to look at the growing crowd of officers, but her vision blurred with tears. This wasn't happening. "It couldn't be happening, ma'am. You're under arrest for suspicion of drug activity and resisting arrest," Carter said coldly. "Drug activity? Are you kidding me?" Sam's voice broke as she struggled to speak. "I haven't done anything wrong." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The officers moved like a well-oiled machine, their actions robotic, rehearsed. Sam was dragged toward the back of the patrol car, her body shaking with fear and disbelief. Chapter 3, caught on camera. A bright flash cut through the night, and for a moment, Sam was blinded. It wasn't until she heard the clicking sound of a camera phone that she realized someone was filming. Her heart skipped a beat. A man had stepped out of his car and was pointing his phone directly at the scene unfolding before him. Sam saw the red light of a live stream app blinking on the screen. More people were gathering now, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices. "Hey, what's going on here?" someone in the crowd shouted. "What did she do?" Sam could barely hear the growing murmur of voices over the pounding of her own heart, but she knew one thing for sure: her ordeal was no longer happening in the dark. People were watching. People were recording. Officer Carter seemed to notice the phone too because his grip on Sam's arm tightened. "Get her in the car. Now." The other officers quickly complied, shoving her into the back seat of the patrol car. Sam's head hit the doorframe, sending a wave of dizziness through her, but she barely registered the pain. Her mind was spinning too fast, trying to keep up with what was happening, her face pressed against the cold window as the patrol car sped away, the crowd and the flashing lights fading into the distance. But the red light of that camera phone burned in her memory. Someone had seen. Someone had filmed. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope. Chapter 4, the aftermath. It was hours later when Sam was finally released from the police station, her wrists bruised from the handcuffs and her body shaking from the trauma of the night. She hadn't been formally charged with anything, but the damage had already been done. She couldn't shake the feeling that her life was never going to be the same again. The moment she stepped outside, she was swarmed by reporters and flashing cameras. The video from the convenience store parking lot had gone viral, millions of views in just a few hours. It was all over social media, news outlets, and talk shows. "Racial profiling or justice," the headlines screamed. Sam had become the face of the latest viral controversy. Her every move was scrutinized, her past picked apart by strangers who knew nothing about her but were eager to weigh in on her life. Some supported her, calling the police actions outrageous and unjust. Others questioned her behavior, asking why she hadn't simply complied. Sam's phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, family, and reporters wanting her side of the story. But all she wanted was for it to be over. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring blankly at the screen. Her lawyer, a family friend, had advised her not to speak to the media yet, but how could she stay silent when the world was watching? Chapter 5, the fight for justice. The days that followed were a blur of protests, interviews, and legal battles. Sam became an unwilling symbol of the fight against racial profiling. Her face was plastered on posters and banners as people took to the streets, demanding justice for her and others like her who had been unjustly targeted by law enforcement. But for Sam, the ordeal was far from over. The police department refused to back down, claiming that the officers had acted within their rights and that Sam had been resisting arrest. They released their own footage, body cam videos that painted a different picture, one where Sam's actions seemed more erratic, more dangerous. The public was divided. Some believed Sam's account, pointing to the racial tension that had sparked the incident in the first place. Others sided with the police, arguing that law enforcement had done what they needed to do to maintain order. Sam felt trapped in a whirlwind of opinions, none of which felt like her own. The truth was messy. Chapter 6, Behind the headline, Sam sat in her apartment, a small, one-bedroom place that now felt like both a refuge and a prison. The constant stream of notifications on her phone had slowed down, but it still buzzed every few minutes with updates from reporters, activists, and friends checking in on her. She had taken a few days off from work, but she knew that she couldn't avoid reality much longer. Her lawyer, Alicia Goodman, was due to arrive any moment. Alicia had been a beacon of hope throughout this nightmare, always composed, always one step ahead. Sam heard a knock at her door and let her in. Alicia was a small woman, but her presence was commanding. She dropped a stack of papers onto Sam's kitchen counter and sighed. "They're not backing down," she said without preamble. Sam didn't respond at first. She had expected this. "What does that mean for me?" Alicia pulled out a chair and sat across from Sam, her sharp eyes softening with concern. "It means that the case will likely go to court. The police department is doubling down on the claim that you resisted arrest, and they're using the body cam footage as their primary evidence. But we have the public on our side, Sam. That viral video has garnered more support than you realize." Sam nodded, though she didn't feel reassured. "But it's not enough, is it? People will still believe what they want to believe. Some think I'm a criminal." Alicia gave her a sympathetic smile. "That's the reality of these cases. Public opinion will always be split. But that doesn't mean we don't fight. I need you to stay strong for this." Sam wanted to be strong. She wanted to be brave. But every time she thought about stepping into a courtroom, facing those officers again, she felt the ground slip out from beneath her. "How do we fight?" Sam asked quietly, staring at her hands. "I didn't resist. I didn't do anything wrong, but they're twisting it. They're making it seem like I did." Alicia leaned forward, her voice firm. "We fight with the truth. And we fight with the fact that this wasn't just an isolated incident. This is about a larger system that's broken. The public is rallying because they know that. You are the face of something bigger now." Sam swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Alicia's words. She hadn't asked to become a symbol, hadn't asked to be the face of a movement. But it was too late to turn back now. Chapter 7, a community divided. The courtroom was cold, sterile, and far removed from the chaos of the streets outside. Sam sat next to Alicia, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to control the tremor in her fingers. Across the room, the officers, Carter, the one who had grabbed her that night, and the others, sat with their own legal team. They looked calm, detached, like this was just another day for them. Sam's stomach churned. The trial had been dragging on for days, each side presenting evidence, witnesses being called to the stand. The body cam footage had been played over and over again, dissected frame by frame. The officers' accounts painted a picture of a tense situation, of a woman acting irrationally and resisting their attempts to control a potentially dangerous situation. But the viral video, the one taken by a bystander, showed a different story. It showed a terrified woman being handcuffed and shoved into a police car for no apparent reason. It showed a woman who had done nothing more than buy groceries and try to go home. The media coverage of the trial was relentless. News outlets and social media platforms were flooded with opinions, analyses, and think pieces about racial profiling, police brutality, and the criminal justice system. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse every day, holding signs that read, "Justice for Sam" and "End racial profiling." But not everyone was on Sam's side. Counter-protesters also showed up, accusing her of playing the victim, of using her race to get sympathy. The tension in the air was palpable, and Sam could feel the weight of every set of eyes on her as she walked into the courthouse each morning. The trial was more than just about her now, it was about a nation divided. Chapter 8, Testimony. It was finally her turn to take the stand. Sam had been dreading this moment, but she knew it was inevitable. Alicia had prepped her for hours, going over every detail of that night, every possible question she could be asked. But now that she was here, sitting in front of the judge, jury, and her accusers, she felt like she might break apart. Alicia stood beside her, her voice steady as she asked Sam to recount the events of that night. Sam took a deep breath and began, her voice shaky at first but growing stronger as she spoke. I went to the convenience store after work, she began. It was late, but I just needed to grab a few things, milk, bread, basic groceries. When I left the store, I was approached by two officers. They told me they needed to ask me some questions. I didn't understand why, but I followed their instructions. Then, they said they had received a report about someone matching my description who was involved in drug activity. I was confused. I had never been involved in anything like that. Her voice wavered, but she pushed through. I told them I didn't know what they were talking about, but they didn't believe me. One of the officers grabbed my arm, and I pulled back. It wasn't because I was resisting, I was scared. I didn't understand why they were treating me like a criminal. Alicia gave her a reassuring nod, and Sam continued. They handcuffed me. They pushed me into the back of the car. I was crying. I kept asking what I did wrong, but they wouldn't answer me. It wasn't until later that I found out they were accusing me of resisting arrest. When Alicia had finished asking her questions, it was the defense attorney's turn. He was slick, polished, and knew exactly how to manipulate the narrative. Ms. Whitfield, he began, his voice smooth as silk, would you describe yourself as someone who is easily frightened? Sam blinked, unsure of how to respond. I don't, let me rephrase, he said, cutting her off. When the officers approached you, did you feel threatened? Yes, Sam answered, her voice firm. And when you felt threatened, did you act out of fear? Yes. So, when Officer Carter grabbed your arm, you pulled away because you were scared? Yes. And would you say that your actions, pulling away from an officer, could be interpreted as resisting? Sam hesitated. No. I wasn't trying to resist. I was just scared. But you pulled away, didn't you? The attorney pressed. Yes, but, no further questions, he said, turning back to his seat with a satisfied smirk. Sam's heart sank. She had fallen right into his trap. Chapter 9. The verdict. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back into the room. Sam sat frozen in her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Alicia gave her a reassuring squeeze, but Sam could barely feel it. Her mind was spinning, her heart racing. This was it. The judge asked the jury for their verdict, and the foreman stood up, a piece of paper in his hands. We, the jury, find the defendant. Sam held her breath, not guilty of resisting arrest. A wave of relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. But guilty of obstructing an officer in the line of duty. Sam's heart plummeted. She felt like she had been punched in the gut. The room spun around her as the judge thanked the jury and dismissed them. The officers across the room shared small, satisfied smiles, while Sam sat there, numb. She had lost. Chapter 10. After the trial, the media was relentless in the days following the trial. Headlines screamed about the verdict, with some praising the decision and others condemning it. The protests outside the courthouse grew larger, more impassioned, as people demanded justice for Sam, but Sam couldn't think about the movement. She couldn't think about the fight for justice, or racial profiling, or any of the things people were talking about. All she could think about was how her life had been ripped apart. She had been found guilty. Her name would forever be tied to this case, to this moment. No matter what she did, she would always be the woman who obstructed an officer. Her career was in jeopardy. Her relationships were strained. She felt like a shell of the person she used to be. Chapter 11. A new beginning. Months passed, and the world moved on. New controversies, new cases took the spotlight, and Sam's story began to fade into the background. But Sam hadn't forgotten. She couldn't forget. Her life had changed in ways she could never have imagined. She had lost so much, but she had also gained something: perspective. She had seen the ugliness of the world, but she had also seen its beauty. The support she had received from strangers, from friends, from people who believed in her, had been overwhelming, and so, Sam made a decision. She couldn't go back to the way things were before, but she could move forward. She could take what had happened to her and use it to make a difference. She started speaking at events, sharing her story, advocating for change. She joined organizations dedicated to ending racial profiling and police brutality. She became an activist, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. This wasn't the life Sam had envisioned for herself, but it was the life she had now. And she was determined to make it count. The end. Chapter 1. The Whispering Shadows of Meadowbrook. Meadowbrook was the kind of town where the mundane became a ritual. There was a certain rhythm to life here, a slow, methodical dance of day-to-day interactions, where everyone had their role to play. The lawns were manicured to perfection, the streets were always clean, and even the grocery store had a warm, familial hum. It was as if the town operated on invisible strings, gently pulling its residents along a path of tranquil sameness. But behind the white picket fences and well-kept hedges, not everything was as peaceful as it seemed. Beneath the surface, there were cracks, small fractures in the facade of harmony that few dared to acknowledge. These fissures were born from whispered judgments, lingering stares, and the unspoken rules that kept people in their places. It was a town where everyone knew each other, but not all relationships were as welcoming as they appeared. Sarah Whitman was one of the town's most recognizable figures. Her blonde hair was always perfectly styled, and her wardrobe was impeccable. With her daughter Lily by her side, she commanded attention wherever she went. Sarah took pride in her image. She was the quintessential suburban mom, involved in every community event from bake sales to the PDA. Meadowbrook was her stage, and she played her part flawlessly. But Sarah had her secrets. Deep down, she harbored a quiet resentment, a simmering dislike for those who didn't fit her image of what was right. She never spoke of it openly, never let it surface for others to see, but it was there, a small, gnawing sense of superiority that clouded her interactions with anyone who didn't quite look or act like her. She told herself it wasn't hatred, just discomfort, but the truth was far more sinister. On the other side of town, Isaiah lived a life that was markedly different. He was young, barely 6 years old, with wide, curious eyes and a head full of soft curls. His mother, Amina, had moved to Meadowbrook a few years ago, hoping to provide her son with a better life. Isaiah loved the town's parks and the friendly neighborhood dogs, but he had never felt quite at home here. There was always a sense that he and his mother were outsiders, tolerated but never fully embraced. One afternoon, while playing in the park, Isaiah had met Lily. They had hit it off instantly, laughing and chasing each other around the playground. For Isaiah, it had been one of the few moments where he felt like he belonged, like Meadowbrook wasn't such a cold place after all. But for Sarah, the sight of her daughter playing with a black boy had stirred something unpleasant inside her, a quiet discomfort she couldn't shake. She had pulled Lily away, telling herself it was nothing, but the image of the two children together lingered in her mind. Days passed, and the incident at the park faded from memory, replaced by the everyday demands of suburban life. But for Sarah, that unease remained. She found herself watching Isaiah from a distance whenever she saw him in town, her eyes narrowing as if she were searching for something, some reason to validate her discomfort. And then, one Saturday afternoon at Meadow Fresh, the local grocery store, that opportunity presented itself. Chapter 2, The Moment of Decision. It was a typical Saturday. Sarah and Lily were out for their weekly grocery run. The aisles of Meadow Fresh bustled with activity, the sound of shopping carts rolling over linoleum blending with the soft hum of overhead lights. Sarah guided Lily through the store with practiced ease, selecting items with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. As they reached the cereal aisle, Sarah spotted him. Isaiah was standing a few feet away, his small hands reaching for a box of cookies on a lower shelf. He was alone, his mother out of sight somewhere else in the store. A chill ran through Sarah as her eyes fixated on the boy. He didn't belong here, not in her town, not near her daughter. The thought crept into her mind unbidden, and before she could stop herself, she was walking toward him. "Stay right here, sweetheart," she whispered to Lily, leaving her daughter behind as she approached Isaiah. Isaiah looked up, his innocent face framed by dark curls, unaware of the storm that was about to break. Sarah stood before him, her arms crossed, the weight of her gaze heavy on the young boy. "Where's your mommy, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice tinged with a false sweetness. Isaiah hesitated, glancing toward the produce section. She's getting apples," he replied, his voice small, unsure. Sarah glanced in the direction he had pointed, spotting Amina in the distance. For a brief moment, guilt flickered in her chest. She could simply turn around, go back to her shopping, leave the boy alone. But that dark voice in her head whispered louder. "He doesn't belong here. He's different." Her eyes dropped to the cookies in Isaiah's hands, and an idea formed. It was an ugly, twisted thought, but it felt satisfying. If she could just get rid of him, make it clear that people like him didn't belong in her perfect little world, then everything would be right again. She leaned down, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "Are you sure you're not going to steal those?" Isaiah's eyes widened, and his grip on the cookies tightened. "No," he stammered, "I'm gonna ask my mom." Sarah's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculated look. "I think you were going to take them without paying," she said, louder now, her voice carrying over the hum of the store. Isaiah's heart pounded in his chest. He shook his head frantically, his small voice pleading. "No. I wasn't." But it was too late. Shoppers nearby turned to see what was happening, their curiosity piqued. Sarah stood tall, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression one of righteous indignation. "Excuse me," she called out. "This boy was about to steal something. Can someone help?" Isaiah's world came crashing down. Panic surged through him as two store employees appeared, followed quickly by a pair of police officers who had been patrolling the area. Their faces were unreadable as they approached, but Isaiah felt a cold dread creeping up his spine. "I didn't do anything," Isaiah whispered, clutching the cookies as if they were his last defense against the accusations being thrown at him. But no one seemed to hear him. Chapter 3, The Unraveling. The police officers were gentle but firm as they questioned Isaiah. One of them, a tall man with a soft voice, knelt down to the boy's level. "Where's your mom, buddy?" Isaiah pointed toward the produce section, his hand shaking. "She's over there. I wasn't stealing, I swear." The officer nodded, but the suspicion lingered in his eyes. Sarah watched from a few feet away, her arms still crossed, satisfaction swelling in her chest. She had done it. She had put him in his place. But as she stood there, watching the scene unfold, a strange unease settled over her. This wasn't what she had expected. The power she had felt just moments ago was fading, replaced by something else, something darker. Doubts began to creep in, but it was too late to stop what she had set in motion. Amina appeared from around the corner, her face pale with fear as she saw the officers surrounding her son. "Isaiah," she cried, rushing toward him. She dropped her bag of apples, not caring that they rolled across the floor. "What's going on?" Isaiah ran into his mother's arms, sobbing. "I didn't do anything, Mom. I didn't take anything." Amina held him close, her eyes flashing with anger as she turned to the officers. "My son didn't steal anything. He's just a child. What's going on here?" The officers exchanged glances, their expressions softening. "We're just following up on a report," one of them said, gesturing toward Sarah. "This woman said she saw him trying to steal." Amina's eyes locked on Sarah, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. There was something in Amina's gaze that shook Sarah to her core, a mix of anger and sorrow, of disbelief and betrayal. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, her hands trembling. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The store manager arrived, and soon after, they reviewed the security footage. It took only minutes to confirm what Isaiah had been saying all along: he hadn't stolen anything. The cookies had never left his hands. He had been an innocent boy, browsing the shelves like any other child. Sarah's world crumbled around her. The weight of what she had done hit her with the force of a freight train. She had lied, she had used her position of privilege to manipulate the situation, and now everyone knew the truth. the police officer, who had initially believed her, turned to Sarah with a look of disdain. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "we'll be filing a report about this incident. You're free to go, but I suggest you think carefully about your actions next time." Sarah couldn't breathe. The walls of the store seemed to close in on her as she hurried toward the exit, the stares of the other shoppers following her like ghosts. She had thought she was in control, but now she was the one being judged. Chapter 4. The consequences. Word of the incident spread through Meadowbrook like wildfire. By Monday morning, everyone knew about what had happened at Meadowfresh. Sarah Whitman, the woman who had once been admired by the community, was now a pariah. The whispers followed her everywhere she went, at the grocery store, at the PDA meetings, even in her own neighborhood. The perfect life she had built for herself was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. People avoided her now, their polite smiles replaced with cold stares. Even Lily's playdates began to dry up as other parents quietly distanced themselves from the Whitman family. Sarah's husband, oblivious to the full extent of the damage, tried to reassure her that it would all blow over, but Sarah knew better. Her name had become synonymous with shame, with prejudice, with lies. Meanwhile, Isaiah struggled to move past what had happened. Though he had done nothing wrong, the memory of that day haunted him. The fear, the humiliation, the knowledge that a stranger had tried to ruin his life for no reason other than the color of his skin, it stuck with him. But Isaiah was resilient, and with the unwavering support of his mother, he began to heal. Chapter 5. The final reckoning. Years passed. Isaiah grew into a strong, compassionate young man, determined to make a difference in the world. The memory of Meadowfresh remained with him, a reminder of the prejudice that still existed, but also a motivation to fight against it. He studied law, dedicating his life to helping those who, like him, had been wrongfully accused, mistreated, or marginalized. As for Sarah, her life never fully recovered. She remained in Meadowbrook, but she was no longer the queen bee of the community. She lived in the shadow of her actions, haunted by the consequences of her lie. Her name became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the smallest act of prejudice could have far-reaching, devastating consequences. Isaiah never saw Sarah again after that day in the grocery store, but he didn't need to. He had moved on, building a life for himself that was defined not by the hatred of others, but by the strength of his own character. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Ban ko thay dong nay kong, kan malagan hok het han plus t nan tin veo zalo night, 08686.01263. Ban de noi teep tuc fat trien ka chien chapt de noi, ChatGPT. Chapter 6. The echo of truth. The years after the incident at Meadowfresh were a slow, arduous climb for Isaiah and his mother, Amina. Although they stayed in Meadowbrook, the town that had once seemed so full of opportunity now felt like a cage, a place haunted by that dark day when the truth was questioned and dignity nearly lost. Amina, a strong-willed woman with sharp features and a soft smile, refused to let the incident define them. She had always been the pillar of Isaiah's world, and even now, as her son struggled to process the emotional wounds left behind, she remained steadfast. "Isaiah, this world will sometimes fail to see your worth," she told him one evening, as they sat on their porch, the sun setting behind the rows of identical houses. "But it doesn't matter what they think. What matters is what you know about yourself. The truth always finds a way out." Isaiah nodded, though the weight of her words pressed heavily on his young heart. He was in high school now, a tall, lanky teenager with a bright future ahead of him. His intelligence shone through in every class, but he carried the quiet burden of that day at Meadowfresh like a scar that refused to fade. His peers knew the story, but most had forgotten the specifics, only remembering the gossip and rumors. For Isaiah, it was still crystal clear. Though time moved forward, his mind often wandered back to the sight of the officers approaching him, the fear gripping his chest, and the humiliation of standing accused of a crime he had never even thought of committing. He still heard Sarah Whitman's voice in his nightmares sometimes, her sweet smile twisted into something menacing as she pointed the finger. Yet, Isaiah was not a boy anymore. As he grew older, his understanding of the world deepened. His love for justice, his belief in fairness, and his drive to ensure that no one else would experience what he had grown stronger by the day. He devoured books on civil rights and history, drawing inspiration from figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, and others who had fought not with fists, but with words and action. He was becoming someone who could make a difference, but the weight of Meadowbrook still pressed down on him, and it wasn't until his senior year of high school that the real reckoning began. Chapter 7, A Community on Edge. Sarah Whitman had become something of a ghost in Meadowbrook. After the incident at the grocery store, her once bustling social life had dwindled to almost nothing. The PTA meetings, the bake sales, the community events, she was no longer the woman everyone flocked to for guidance or friendship. People were polite, but distant. Her name, her presence, carried a silent weight. At home, things weren't much better. Her husband, Michael, was supportive in the beginning, believing that the town would forget in time. But as the months turned to years, their relationship grew strained. Michael started spending more time at work, and Sarah felt isolated in the very place she had once ruled. Worst of all, her relationship with Lily had changed. Lily, now a teenager, had grown distant, spending more time with friends and avoiding her mother whenever possible. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her daughter blamed her for something, though they never spoke about it. Perhaps it was because Lily had seen the aftermath of what Sarah had done, had seen Isaiah humiliated, his innocence stripped away in the grocery store. Or maybe it was because Lily had grown into a young woman who could see the world in ways her mother never had. One evening, as Sarah sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched cup of tea, Lily walked in. The tension between them was palpable. Lily had grown into a striking young woman, with her father's dark hair and her mother's sharp features, but she carried an air of independence that Sarah had never had at that age. "Mom," Lily began, her voice soft but firm, "I want to talk to you." Sarah looked up, her heart heavy. She had been waiting for this moment, dreading it, but knowing it would come. "I know what you did that day at the grocery store," Lily continued. "I know you accused Isaiah of stealing when he wasn't. I know you lied." Sarah flinched at the word lied, but she didn't interrupt. "Why did you do it?" Lily's eyes were searching, her voice full of something Sarah couldn't quite place, disappointment, anger, maybe even pity. Sarah's throat tightened. She had spent years trying to bury that day, trying to convince herself that she had been right to act the way she did, that it had been a misunderstanding. But now, faced with her daughter's clear-eyed accusation, she couldn't hide anymore. "I don't know," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "I was scared. I saw him, and I thought he was going to do something wrong. I don't know why I thought that. I was wrong." Lily shook her head, her eyes filled with sadness. "You weren't scared, Mom. You just didn't want to see him near me. You didn't like that we were playing together." The silence that followed was unbearable. Sarah felt a weight on her chest, a suffocating guilt that she had carried for too long. "I'm sorry," Sarah said finally, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry, Lily." But Lily didn't respond. She turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Sarah alone with her guilt. Chapter 8, The Path Forward. Isaiah stood at the front of the auditorium, his high school graduation cap balanced precariously on his head. The room was filled with parents, teachers, and students, all there to celebrate the accomplishments of the graduating class. For Isaiah, this day meant more than just a diploma. It was the culmination of years of hard work, determination, and the quiet, unwavering support of his mother. As he stepped up to the podium to deliver his speech, he had been chosen as valedictorian. His eyes scanned the crowd. He saw Amina, beaming with pride, and beside her, a few of his close friends. But there was one person he didn't expect to see. Sarah Whitman sat toward the back, her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable. Lily was beside her, but it was clear from their body language that something had shifted between them. Isaiah's heart raced. He hadn't seen Sarah since that day at the grocery store, and though he had tried to move past it, seeing her now brought everything back. But this wasn't a moment for anger. This was his moment, a day to celebrate how far he had come, and to look forward to the future. He took a deep breath and began his speech. "Today, we stand at the edge of a new beginning," Isaiah said, his voice steady. "For many of us, this is a moment of reflection, a time to look back at where we've been and think about where we're going. We've all faced challenges, some of us more than others, but we're here now because we didn't let those challenges define us." As he spoke, his mind drifted back to that fateful day at Meadow Fresh, to the moment when he had been accused, humiliated, and almost destroyed. But he had survived. He had thrived. "I want to thank my family, my friends, and my teachers for believing in me when it wasn't always easy to believe in myself," he continued. "And I want to say something to those of you who may have doubted me, or who may have thought I didn't belong. I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere." The crowd erupted in applause, but Isaiah's eyes were locked on Sarah. She was staring down at her hands, her face pale. For the first time, he saw not the woman who had wronged him, but a person who had been broken by her own actions. As the ceremony ended, Isaiah walked toward his mother, who embraced him tightly, tears of joy in her eyes. But before they could leave, someone else approached. It was Lily. "Isaiah," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For everything." Isaiah looked at her, surprised. "You don't have to apologize. You didn't do anything wrong." Lily nodded, her eyes filled with guilt. "Maybe not directly, but I didn't stop it either. And I want you to know that I see it now. I see what my mom did, and it wasn't right." Isaiah smiled, a small, sad smile. "Thank you," he said simply. As Lily walked away, Isaiah turned to his mother, and together, they left the auditorium. The future stretched out before him, full of possibilities. But the past would always be there, a reminder of the darkness that could creep into even the most perfect of places. And though Sarah Whitman remained in Meadowbrook, her name would forever be tied to a moment of cruelty and shame, a cautionary tale of what happens when fear and prejudice go unchecked. Chapter 9. The Future We Build. Years later, Isaiah became a successful civil rights lawyer, dedicating his life to ensuring that no child, no person, would ever face the kind of injustice he had endured. He fought for those who had no voice, those who were marginalized, oppressed, or wrongfully accused. In a world that was often filled with hate and division, Isaiah stood as a beacon of hope, a reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would always find its way to the surface. As for Sarah Whitman, she remained in Meadowbrook, a relic of a past she could never fully escape. She spent the rest of her days in quiet reflection, haunted by the lie that had forever changed her life and the lives of those around her. In the end, it wasn't Meadowbrook that had been broken, it was the people within it. And though the town continued to thrive, its manicured lawns and perfect streets hiding the cracks beneath, the lesson of Isaiah's story lingered. Prejudice, no matter how small, no matter how subtle, has the power to destroy, but so too does truth have the power to heal. Chapter 1. The Arrest. It was a sweltering afternoon in the heart of the city, and the streets buzzed with the usual rhythm of urban life. People shuffled about, cars honked impatiently, and the distant wail of sirens was as constant as the hum of electricity running through the towering buildings. But there was one corner of this vast city that was about to become the focus of everyone's attention, a small, unassuming restaurant nestled between a row of shops. The restaurant, Hale's Diner, had long been a staple in the neighborhood. To the untrained eye, it was just another spot serving greasy food and cold drinks to locals. But for years, rumors had swirled about the management's discriminatory practices. Stories had surfaced of how certain patrons were refused service, of how black and brown customers were treated differently than their white counterparts. These stories, however, had always been whispered, never quite making the leap from rumor to public scandal until today. Outside the restaurant, a man named Jamal Williams, a black man in his early 30s, stood on the sidewalk, frustration etched across his face. His clothes were stained from working long hours at a nearby factory, his hands calloused from hard labor. He had just been forcibly removed from the diner, his only crime being the color of his skin. He had simply walked in, sat down, and asked for a cup of coffee, but the manager, a wiry man with thin lips and cold eyes, had refused to serve him. "You need to leave," the manager had said, his voice low but firm, as if this were a routine matter. "We don't serve your kind here." Jamal had protested, of course. In a world that was supposedly moving forward, he refused to be treated like this. He had every right to be there, every right to order a meal just like any other customer. But the manager had called the police, and now two white officers, Officer Carter and Officer Reynolds, stood in front of him, their expressions unreadable beneath their dark sunglasses. "Sir, you need to calm down," Officer Carter said, his tone placating but with an undercurrent of impatience. His hand rested casually on the baton strapped to his waist. Jamal could feel the heat of the sun on his neck, but the real heat, the kind that burned deep in his gut, came from the injustice of the situation. "Calm down," he repeated, incredulous. "I didn't do anything wrong. All I wanted was a damn coffee." Reynolds, the younger of the two officers, shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the small crowd that had begun to gather around them. People were watching, some with phones raised, recording the scene, others whispering to each other, but none daring to step in. "We got a call about a disturbance," Carter continued, his voice steady. "You're causing a scene." Jamal clenched his fists, trying to control the anger rising in his chest. "I'm causing a scene. You're here because they don't want a black man sitting in their restaurant. That's it. That's the whole damn story." The officers exchanged a glance, the kind that said they'd heard this all before, that they were tired of hearing it. Reynolds finally spoke up, his voice more uncertain than his partner's. "Look, man, maybe it's best if you go somewhere else, all right? We don't want any trouble here." "Somewhere else?" Jamal spat the words back at him. "Where exactly am I supposed to go where I won't be treated like this? This is America, right? Or did I miss something?" The crowd grew thicker, and the tension in the air was palpable. Jamal's voice rose as he continued, unable to keep the anger from spilling out. "This is what you do, right? You show up, you protect them, and you expect me to just walk away like I don't matter, like I'm invisible." Carter stepped forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. "You need to lower your voice and step back. Now." But Jamal couldn't stop now. The injustice of it all was suffocating, the weight of every racial slur, every slight, every moment of inequality he had endured in his life pressing down on him. "No," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "No, I'm not stepping back. I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying right here, because this is my right." Before anyone could react, Carter grabbed Jamal's arm, yanking him forward with a force that made him stumble. Jamal resisted, pulling his arm away, but in seconds, both officers were on him, forcing him to the ground. The scene exploded into chaos. People shouted, some filming, others calling out for the officers to stop. Jamal struggled beneath them, his face pressed into the hot concrete, his arms twisted behind his back as Carter slapped the handcuffs onto his wrists. "I didn't do anything," Jamal yelled, his voice hoarse with desperation. "I didn't do anything wrong. But it didn't matter. To the officers, to the management of the diner, to the system that had let this happen, Jamal was just another black man causing a disturbance, another problem to be dealt with, quickly and quietly. As the officers hauled Jamal to his feet, dragging him towards their patrol car, he looked out at the crowd. He saw the faces of people watching, some sympathetic, some indifferent, and a few even satisfied with what was happening. And then he saw a familiar face, the manager of Hale's diner, standing in the doorway, arms crossed, a smug smile playing on his lips, and in that moment, Jamal understood. This wasn't just about him. This was about something much bigger, something much deeper, something that had been festering in the soul of the country for far too long. It was about power, and who had it, and who didn't. It was about control. As the police car door slammed shut behind him, Jamal's mind raced. He knew this wouldn't be the end. He wouldn't let it be. He couldn't. This moment, this arrest, this was just the beginning. Chapter 2. Behind closed doors. The small police precinct was quiet, save for the sound of the buzzing fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of papers. Jamal sat in a holding cell, his head resting against the cold, concrete wall. The adrenaline from the arrest had faded, leaving behind a heavy feeling of defeat. His wrists ached from the tight handcuffs, and his mind replayed the events of the day over and over again. That he didn't know how long he had been sitting there when the door to the precinct opened, and Detective Sarah Monroe walked in. Unlike the officers who had arrested him, Monroe was different. She had grown up in the city, a daughter of working-class parents who had taught her the value of justice and fairness. She had joined the force to make a difference, but over the years, she had seen more than her fair share of corruption and prejudice within the system. Monroe had been assigned Jamal's case after the arrest report landed on her desk, and as she read through the details, something didn't sit right with her. The description of the disturbance didn't match the reality she knew all too well, how often simple things like a black man ordering a meal could escalate into something much darker. She approached Jamal's cell, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Jamal looked up as she stood in front of him, her expression calm, but with a hint of something he couldn't quite place. "Jamal Williams?" she asked, her voice steady but not unkind. "Yeah," Jamal muttered, his voice rough from hours of silence. "I'm Detective Monroe. I've been assigned to your case." Jamal let out a bitter laugh. "Great. What's the charge?" "Ordering coffee while black." Monroe didn't flinch. She had heard that tone before, the hardened sarcasm of someone who had been let down by the system too many times to count. "I read the report," she said, pulling up a chair and sitting across from him. "And I have some questions." "Let me guess," Jamal said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You want me to tell you how it was all just a misunderstanding, right? That I overreacted, and the officers were just doing their job?" Monroe shook her head. "I want to know the truth." "Your truth?" Jamal looked at her, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Why? So you can twist it around and make me look like the bad guy?" "No," Monroe replied, her voice firm. "I want to hear your side of the story because it's my job to get to the bottom of this. And because I believe you." Jamal was silent for a moment, his eyes searching her face for any sign of deceit. He had learned not to trust too easily, especially when it came to people in uniform. But there was something about Monroe, something in the way she spoke, the way she looked at him, that made him pause. "Fine," he said, leaning back against the wall. "I walked into that diner, sat down, and asked for a cup of coffee. That's it. Next thing I know, the manager's telling me to leave. Said they don't serve people like me. I told him I wasn't going anywhere. He called the cops, and here I am." Monroe listened carefully, her eyes never leaving his. "Did he say anything specific?" Jamal nodded. "He said, 'We don't serve your kind here.'" "And the officers?" Monroe asked. "What happened when they arrived?" Jamal clenched his fists, the memory of the arrest still fresh in his mind. "They showed up and treated me like I was the problem. Told me to calm down, said I was causing a scene. But I wasn't doing anything. I was just standing there, trying to explain what happened. Then they grabbed me, threw me to the ground, and arrested me like I was some kind of criminal." Monroe sighed, leaning back in her chair. It was a familiar story, one she had heard too many times in her career. And yet, each time, it filled her with the same sense of anger and frustration. How many more Jamal Williamses were there? How many more men and women had been arrested, beaten, or worse, for simply existing in a world that saw them as a threat? "I believe you," she said again, her voice quiet but resolute. "But I need more than just your word if I'm going to help you." Jamal's eyes flashed with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "Help me? How?" Monroe leaned forward, her eyes locked onto his. "We're going to take down that diner. We're going to expose what's been happening there for years. But I need you to trust me. For the first time since his arrest, Jamal felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Chapter 5. The fight for justice. Over the next few weeks, Monroe dug deeper into the Hale family's connections, uncovering a web of corruption that reached far beyond the walls of their diner. Financial records showed suspicious donations to local politicians, while complaints from former employees hinted at a pattern of discrimination and harassment that had been covered up for years, but it wasn't enough. Monroe needed more: a smoking gun that could bring down the entire operation. She enlisted the help of a few trusted colleagues within the precinct, officers who shared her sense of justice and were willing to take on the risk of investigating their own. One night, after a long day of chasing leads, Monroe received a call from her contact, the one she had asked to dig into Hale's diner. "I've got something," the voice on the other end said, excitement lacing their words. "You're not going to believe this, Sarah. There's a file, an old file from a lawsuit that was buried years ago. It links the Hale family to illegal surveillance. They've been recording conversations, blackmailing people, and paying off officials to keep it all quiet." Monroe's heart raced. This was it, the break she had been waiting for. "Send me everything," she said, barely able to contain her anticipation. Within minutes, Monroe had the file in her hands. As she scrolled through the documents, her eyes widened. There were transcripts of conversations between the Hale family and prominent figures in the city: politicians, police officers, even judges. They had been using the diner as a front, recording private conversations of their high-profile customers, then using that information to blackmail them into compliance. This wasn't just a case of racial discrimination. This was a full-blown criminal operation. Monroe knew what she had to do. She contacted the district attorney's office, handing over the evidence she had gathered. With this new information, they could build a case not just against Hale's diner, but against the entire corrupt system that had allowed them to operate with impunity for so long. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. The trial that followed was one of the most high-profile cases the city had seen in years. The media swarmed the courthouse, eager to report on the fall of the once powerful Hale family. Testimonies from former employees, recordings of blackmail conversations, and financial records all painted a damning picture of a family that had built its empire on fear and corruption. Jamal was called to the stand, his testimony a key piece of the prosecution's case. He recounted the day he was arrested, the discrimination he had faced, and the systemic racism that had allowed the Hale family to continue their operations for so long. His words resonated with the jury, who sat in silence as he described the pain and humiliation he had endured. In the end, the Hale family was convicted on multiple charges, including illegal surveillance, blackmail, and racial discrimination. The diner was shut down, and several high-profile figures who had been implicated in the scandal were forced to resign. But for Monroe and Jamal, the victory was bittersweet. They had won the battle, but the war against systemic racism and corruption was far from over. As they stood outside the courthouse on the final day of the trial, Monroe turned to Jamal. "You did it," she said, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You stood up, and you won." Jamal nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, we won. But this isn't the end, is it?" Monroe shook her head. "No. It's just the beginning." Jamal looked out at the bustling city around them, the weight of the future heavy on his shoulders. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. Chapter 7. New beginnings. Weeks after the trial, the city seemed to have settled back into its usual rhythm. Life moved on, as it always did, but for Jamal Williams, nothing would ever be the same. He walked through the streets with a newfound sense of purpose, though the scars of his ordeal, both emotional and physical, were still fresh. Despite the victory in court, Jamal had to grapple with the personal consequences of standing up against the Hale family and their powerful connections. He lost his job at the factory, citing that his sudden notoriety made his co-workers uncomfortable. His landlord, after months of delay, sent him an eviction notice claiming violations in the lease that never existed. And yet, despite all the pushback, Jamal felt stronger than he had in years. As he walked past Hale's diner, now shuttered with graffiti plastered across the boarded-up windows. Jamal paused. The anger he once felt had softened, replaced by a quiet resolve. That diner, once a symbol of discrimination and oppression, was gone, but the fight wasn't over. A car pulled up beside him, and Detective Monroe stepped out, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Jamal," she called, walking toward him. "I've been looking for you." Jamal smiled, surprised. "You've been looking for me? What's going on?" "I wanted to give you something," Monroe said, handing him a folder. "It's a job offer." Jamal raised an eyebrow as he opened the folder, his eyes scanning the papers inside. It was an official offer from the city to work as a community liaison, helping to address racial injustice and police reform. He looked back at Monroe, his expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. "Why me?" he asked. "I'm not qualified for something like this." Monroe shook her head. "You're exactly what we need. Someone who's been through it. Someone who's seen the worst of the system and fought back. We need people like you to make sure this doesn't happen again." Jamal hesitated. It was a huge responsibility, one he wasn't sure he was ready for. But as he looked around at the city, the faces of people walking by, going about their lives as if nothing had changed, he knew he couldn't turn it down. This was his chance to make a real difference, to ensure that no one else had to go through what he did. "All right," Jamal said, nodding slowly. "I'll do it." Monroe smiled, relief evident on her face. "Good. We'll get started next week." Chapter 8, The Ripple Effect. Jamal's first day as a community liaison was both overwhelming and eye-opening. He was introduced to activists, community leaders, and local politicians, all of whom were working together to address the systemic issues that had allowed people like the Hale family to thrive for so long. It was a world he had never been a part of, but one he quickly realized was crucial to real change. His role was to listen, to the voices that had been silenced for too long, to the stories of injustice and oppression that echoed his own experience. He sat in on meetings, attended rallies, and spoke to people in neighborhoods that had been neglected by the system for years, but as he quickly learned, change didn't come easy. The city's political machine was slow to act, and for every step forward, there were 2 steps back. Some of the same officials who had been exposed in the Hale scandal still held power, and they were determined to keep things the way they were. Jamal faced resistance from all sides. Threatening phone calls became a regular occurrence, and his past was dragged through the mud in an attempt to discredit him. But he refused to back down. He had already faced the worst, and nothing could shake his resolve now. One day, after a particularly grueling meeting with city officials, Jamal found himself standing on the steps of City Hall, his mind racing. He had been trying to push through a proposal for police reform, but it had been met with heavy resistance from the police union. He felt the weight of the system bearing down on him, as if he were trying to fight a mountain with a single stone. Just as he was about to leave, Monroe appeared beside him, her presence as steadying as ever. "Tough day?" she asked, her voice sympathetic. Jamal sighed. "They shot down the proposal. Said it was too radical." He shook his head. "It feels like I'm not getting anywhere." Monroe placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're making more progress than you realize. Change doesn't happen overnight, but the fact that you're even in that room, having those conversations, is a victory." Jamal looked at her, the frustration still clear in his eyes. "It doesn't feel like a victory. It feels like I'm fighting a losing battle." Monroe smiled gently. "You're not. You're fighting for something bigger than yourself. And that's not something that can be measured in one day, or even 1 year. This is a marathon, not a sprint." Jamal nodded, taking in her words. She was right. The fight for justice wasn't something that could be won in a single battle. It was a long, arduous journey, and he was just getting started. Chapter 3, The System. Detective Monroe sat at her desk, the soft hum of the precinct surrounding her. Papers were strewn across her workspace, case files, statements, arrest reports. But her focus was solely on the one file in front of her, Jamal Williams. She had seen countless cases of injustice, but this one struck a nerve. Jamal's story wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a reflection of a deeply embedded problem that had plagued the city, and the country, for far too long. Monroe took a deep breath, the weight of her task sinking in. She knew that going after Hale's diner wasn't going to be easy. The diner had been in the neighborhood for decades, owned by the Hale family, a family with deep connections in the local government and police force. They were untouchable, or at least they seemed to be, but Jamal's case could be the turning point. Monroe was determined to make sure it was. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, but she wasn't ready to go home. Not yet. There was too much at stake. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. "Hey, Sarah. It's been a long time," the voice on the other end said, sounding both surprised and wary. "Yeah, it has," Monroe replied. "I need a favor." The voice paused. "A favor? What kind of favor?" "I need to look into Hale's diner," Monroe said, keeping her voice low. "I need everything you can dig up, financials, complaints, lawsuits, anything that can connect them to something bigger." The voice on the other end sighed. "You're walking into dangerous territory. You know that, right? The Hale family isn't just a local business, they have friends in high places." "I know," Monroe said firmly. "But I can't let this go. They've been getting away with this for too long." There was a long pause. Finally, the voice replied, "All right. I'll see what I can do. But you owe me, Sarah." Monroe smiled grimly. "I know. And thank you." She hung up the phone and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She knew that what she was doing could cost her more than just her career. But she couldn't turn her back on Jamal. Not now. Chapter 4, Shadows of the Past. The next morning, Monroe made her way to the psychiatric facility where Jamal had been transferred after his arrest. She had spent the night poring over reports, trying to find any crack in the diner's seemingly spotless reputation, but she needed more. She needed to hear more from Jamal, about his life, his experiences, and how things had escalated to that fateful day. As she entered the sterile, cold building, the smell of disinfectant stung her nose. The facility was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of the precinct. Monroe signed in at the front desk, then followed the nurse down a long hallway to the visitors area, where Jamal sat, staring blankly at the floor. He looked up as Monroe approached, his eyes still clouded with the weight of everything that had happened. But there was something else there too, a flicker of hope. "Detective," Jamal said softly, nodding his head as she sat across from him. "You came back." "I told you I would," Monroe replied. "How are you holding up?" Jamal let out a bitter laugh. "How do you think? I'm stuck in here, labeled as crazy because I dared to stand up for myself." Monroe leaned forward, her expression serious. "You're not crazy, Jamal. And I'm going to help you. But I need you to help me too." Jamal's eyes narrowed, suspicion creeping back in. "Help you? How?" "I'm going after Hale's diner," Monroe said, her voice steady. "But I need more. I need to know everything you can tell me about what happened before the arrest. Anything that can help me build a case." Jamal was silent for a moment, his gaze drifting to the window, where the sun filtered through the bars on the glass. "You really believe you can take them down? They've been doing this for years. And no one's ever stopped them." "I believe we can expose the truth," Monroe said firmly. "But I need your help to do it." Jamal sighed, running a hand through his tangled dreadlocks. "All right," he said after a long pause. "But this goes way beyond that diner." Monroe frowned. "What do you mean?" Jamal leaned in, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "You think they're just a racist restaurant? There's more to it. They're connected to people in power. Politicians, business owners, cops. They've got their hands in everything. They use their money, their connections, to keep people like me down. To make sure we stay in our place. Monroe felt a chill run down her spine. She had suspected something bigger was at play, but hearing it from Jamal confirmed her fears. "Do you have any proof?" Jamal shook his head. "Not the kind of proof you need. But I've seen things. I've heard things. People talk when they think no one's listening." Monroe took a deep breath, her mind racing. If what Jamal was saying was true, this wasn't just about a single diner or a single arrest. This was about a system designed to protect the powerful and keep the marginalized silent. "I'll look into it," Monroe said, standing up. "But I need you to stay strong, Jamal. We're going to fight this together." Jamal watched her as she walked away, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Chapter 9, The community stands. Months passed, and Jamal's work as a community liaison began to show real results. The community, inspired by his story and his persistence, started to rally behind him. Neighborhood meetings grew larger, rallies became more organized, and local politicians who had once been indifferent began to take notice. One particularly powerful moment came when Jamal was invited to speak at a town hall meeting. The room was packed with people from all walks of life, many of whom had been personally affected by the injustices he was fighting to change. As Jamal stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, he felt a swell of emotion. This was why he had fought so hard, so that people like him, people who had been ignored and oppressed, could finally have a voice. That he cleared his throat and began to speak. "I'm not here to tell you that everything is going to change overnight," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not here to promise you that the system will be fixed tomorrow, or that the people in power will suddenly see the light and do the right thing. But I am here to tell you that we're not alone in this fight. That for every person trying to keep us down, there's someone else standing beside us, ready to lift us up." The room was silent, every eye on him as he continued. "We've seen what happens when we stay silent. We've seen what happens when we accept the status quo. But we don't have to accept it anymore. We have the power to change things. And it starts with each and every one of us." There was a ripple of applause, which quickly grew into a standing ovation. Jamal stood there, overwhelmed by the support, the energy, the determination of the people in that room. It was the first time he truly felt like he was making a difference, and it fueled him to keep going. Chapter 10, A New Legacy. By the end of the year, Jamal's work had led to real, tangible changes in the city. The proposal for police reform, once deemed too radical, had finally been passed, leading to a series of new policies aimed at increasing accountability and transparency within the police force. Hale's Diner, once a symbol of discrimination and corruption, had been transformed into a community center, offering resources and support to those in need. Jamal stood outside the newly opened center, watching as children played in the nearby park and families gathered for a neighborhood event. It was a stark contrast to the day he had been arrested, the day that had changed everything. Monroe walked up beside him, her hands in her pockets as she surveyed the scene. "Not bad," she said, a hint of pride in her voice. "You did good, Jamal." Jamal smiled, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "We did good." Monroe nodded. "Yeah. We did." As they stood there, watching the community come together, Jamal realized something important. His story wasn't just about the fight for justice, it was about the power of standing up, of refusing to be silenced, of believing that change was possible even when the odds were stacked against you. He had been arrested for ordering coffee in a diner, but that moment had sparked a movement. And while the road ahead was still long, and the fight for equality far from over, Jamal knew that he had made a difference. He had left a legacy, one of hope, resilience, and the belief that one person, standing up for what was right, could change the world. Epilogue. The fight continues. Years later, Jamal's name had become synonymous with the fight for racial justice in the city. His story was told in schools, his work honored in community awards, and his legacy cemented in the hearts of those who had followed his journey. But Jamal never sought fame or recognition. For him, it was never about being a hero, it was about making sure that no one else had to go through what he did. It was about dismantling a system that had failed too many for too long, and so, even as new challenges arose, as new battles were fought, Jamal remained at the forefront of the movement, his voice strong, his resolve unwavering because the fight for justice never ends. And neither would he.